All right. I think we'll go ahead and kick off as we've had most folks, I think, have joined in and a few more may trickle through. Thank you very much to everyone on the webinar today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you're joining us from. Welcome to the first of two sessions that we're going to run today to provide an update on the ASI standards revision process. My name is Chelsea Reinhardt. I'm the Standards Director for ASI, and I'm joined here today by Chris Bayless, our Climate Change and Decarbonization Director, and Cameron Jones, our Director of Assurance and Risk. So we look forward to a good session today. We have quite a bit to cover, and we hope to hold some time at the end for questions and discussion. Before we begin, just a reminder on our antitrust compliance policy, which is available on the ASI website and is an important guiding policy for this call today and any meetings chaired by ASI. Second, I want to acknowledge Indigenous peoples and their connections to the traditional lands where we and where ASI members operate. We aim to respect the cultural heritage, the customs, and the beliefs of all Indigenous people, and to pay our respects to elders past and present. So we are on Zoom today. Many of you are not regularly using Zoom, but it does allow us to run interpretation, which is running in Chinese in the morning, and we will have French in our afternoon session. I would invite you to use the Q&A box. You can add any questions in during the session, and we will either address these online. I've got a team of colleagues on the call today, or we will come to them in the discussion Q&A section at the end. And if you can just take a moment and make sure that you are on the right interpretation channel, that would be great. So this morning's call is in Chinese or English, and the afternoon call will be in French or English. If you have any questions about Zoom functionality, you can put them into the Q&A as well, and a colleague of mine will help you out. All right, today's agenda, we're going to start with a quick progress update, the work underway so far on the revision and what's been accomplished since the launch of the project and our previous public webinar, which was back in July. I'm going to talk you through some of the key changes proposed for the ASI performance standard, both in the structure of the standard and also some of the content areas. That will be just a spotlight tour, as of course we don't have time to cover everything in today's call, but hopefully it'll help pique your interest for upcoming consultations next year. Chris will then talk you through some of the evolution of the chain of custody standard and how some of that modified standard is starting to look. And then Cam is going to talk a little bit about the parallel revision process that's going to be unfolding with our assurance model and assurance framework. And then we'll have some time at the end for your questions. So just to start, in terms of timeline, the standards revision project launched formally at the beginning of March this year, and that was built, though, on a foundation of work that was carried out over much of 2024 to really look at how version 3 of the performance standard and version 2 of the chain of custody standard were implementing in practice and the experiences of members who were certifying against those standards. Since March, we have had about 8 months of development work guided by efforts from our working groups, technical experts, and input from members, CSOs, and others. And we have quite a good set of early drafts that have been developed through that process. We are anticipating approval of those consultation drafts sometime early next year, and we're expecting to launch what will be the first of 2 public consultation phases sometime in Q1 of next year. And that's subject to change, of course, depending on how these final drafts come together. I would say that although there's been a lot of work and a lot of drafting input this year, we are still in the relative early stages of this project. In 2026 and maybe into early 2027, we will have 2 60-day public consultation periods. We'll have a lot of analysis of those comments. We'll have further refining and development and adjustment of those drafts and further opportunities for stakeholder input. So it feels like there's been a lot of work done, a lot of discussion, but still it's a relatively early stage of the project. The anticipated launch of those revised standards would be sometime in 2027, and that would be followed then by a transition and implementation period. So you're still looking several years out in the future before these revised standards are likely to become effective for most of you who may be certified entities on the call today. Just a note, many of you may have seen this. This is an overview of our multi-stakeholder governance structure for the standards revision. So sometimes there's a perception or a thought that when we go to revise or adjust our standards, it's really the ASI Secretariat going away in a room together to think about where we need to change or improve things. And actually, it's quite the opposite is true. We are really convening input from a really broad set of stakeholders, civil society, our Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum, technical experts in different areas, our multi-stakeholder working groups, looking at alignment and input from other standards and key partners, and really trying to bring all of those voices together to find a middle ground or a set of compromises on where that bar in our standards should be adjusted and where we should set expectations in those standards. So sometimes that may be hundreds of different perspectives that are coming together on different issues, and we're trying to run that in as transparent of a process and as inclusive of a process as possible. So one of the things that we've been really working hard to do this time around in the revision is to make sure that there are a lot of eyes and a lot of our consultation already on those early drafts, so that we're not working on developing consultation drafts in isolation and then putting those out for public consultation and being hit by big surprises in feedback. So across those 6 thematic working groups, many of you might be participating on the call today. We've had 34 working group meetings since April of this year. We've had 13 individual technical expert detailed reviews of various sections of those drafts to provide input back to the working groups. We had in July and August of this year, those early drafts went out for a whole range of different feedback from labor unions, from experienced ASI auditors to start looking at auditability reviews. A sample of ASI members carried out a feasibility assessment to kind of understand where proposed requirements would be far too challenging to implement and why, where they might already be doing practices that are proposed, and where they might be easy to implement. We also had direct consultations with some of our Chinese members in one-to-one meetings, and that input was really helpful to help understand some of the perspectives that are specific to Chinese members that may not be represented as well through our other working group structures. In parallel, my colleagues Mark and Jess have been coordinating our Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum, coordinating a set of focus groups and discussions to make sure that those IPAF perspectives are really channeled into the process as well, and the issues that are most central from an Indigenous Peoples Advisory perspective forum are being represented into working groups and the Standards Committee. And we've also had dedicated input from some of the CSOs who've been looking at key sections of the draft and providing constructive input. So this screenshot at the top is just showing how some of that feasibility assessment input was aggregated together and provided back to the working groups to give us a sense of where some of the challenging implementation hotspots look like and how requirements might need to be adjusted to address those. All right, so what are we looking at in terms of proposed changes in the performance standard coming out of that process? So first, not new for anyone who has either been part of our working groups or who joined our last webinar, public webinar in July, but there has been some sort of high-level restructuring and shifting around of the performance standard structure. So first, we have reorganized some of those current 11 sections of the performance standard. We now have 3 cross-cutting sections: governance, management systems, which includes a cross-cutting risk assessment as well as management systems focus, and then responsible sourcing and due diligence has now been all brought together as a cross-cutting area as well. We then have 5 thematic or impact-focused sections, one on climate, one on nature, which covers water, biodiversity, emissions to air, etc., one on circularity, which has been elevated into its own thematic area or impact area. Previously, it was nested up under some of the governance structures. Community rights and participation, and then workers' rights and participation. And new in this structure, we've also pulled out a few sections that apply in very specific contexts. So mine closure, bauxite residue and tailings management, and also resettlement and displacement. And those are relatively more comprehensive sections that are really applicable only to a very small set of certified entities. And we wanted to remove them from the main section in the standard to help improve overall usability and make sure that that content is available really just to those who need it and need to apply it. You will see, and I'll show you an example in a moment, that we have a new distinction added between minimum requirements and optional leading practices under each of those thematic areas. So at the moment, we have a set of leading practice requirements under Section 3, responsible sourcing, and then under those 5 thematic areas, as well as around mine closure. And that is the first time that we are looking to introduce some level of differentiation into the performance standard. And the aim there really is to recognize companies that are indeed achieving leading practice, but also to create stronger pathways for continuous improvement in the standard itself. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Throughout the standard, we have tried to really add more materiality and relevance throughout, so that companies really should be focused on areas that are most impactful depending on the type of operation or where you sit in the value chain. And that has meant adjusting applicability in some cases to remove or reduce requirements where impacts are perhaps nice to have, but not as critical for a certain type of operation. Where possible, we have worked to include more outcome-based requirements, and that has been a challenge. In many cases, we've had strong support for outcome-based requirements, but finding outcome requirements that actually fit all contexts and are appropriate and relevant has definitely been a challenge for the working group. So we have indicated where these are being brought into the standard, but they are not as many maybe as we had hoped at the early stages of design in the revision. And last, a very clear message from our membership is to make sure that we're continuing to strengthen and build on the alignment we have with other standards and frameworks. So we are certainly working to maintain the alignment and equivalency that we already have with ISO standards and with the LME responsible sourcing guidelines, but we also are strengthening alignment with the Science-Based Targets Initiative, the Global Industry Standard on Tailings Management, the IFC Performance Standards 5 and 6, and also ISO 59004 on circular economy, amongst others. So just a sort of a sneak preview of format. This is an example of what the current pre-consultation drafts are looking like, and a few points to highlight as you eventually will start to navigate these. First, we have separated out criteria, which is this piece up in green, and that will continue to be the level at which conformance is assessed. So non-conformances would sit at the criteria level. But we have separated it out now for the first time, those sub-requirements that would need to be met to show conformance against the criteria. And in the current ASI Performance Standard version 3, some criteria that we have today have many, many sub-bullet points. And the aim here is to make those sub-bullet points a bit more explicit and a bit more complementary so that there's more transparency and things don't get lost in the implementation or the auditing against those sections. But the conformance remains at this criteria level. The second thing to note is on the applicability. As mentioned, we have really done a materiality review and adjusted applicability in some cases so that certain requirements will only be applicable where the impacts are most material. Third, as noted, you will see a distinction between the kind of minimum requirements, which remain mandatory where they apply, and then those optional leading practices, which at the moment are shaded and have a kind of clear indicator as a leading practice. And then we have also done some work to make sure that in those consultation drafts, the changes from version 3 are clearly identifiable. So you'll be able to track what is being introduced as a new requirement, what is an adjustment on an existing requirement, and what is really an existing requirement carried through from version 3. All right, and then just a moment on the differentiation that's being proposed. So at the moment, the working hypothesis is that this is an optional element of the standard. Companies can be certified just against minimum requirements as per today. But if they choose to, they can also look to achieve a leading practice level in certain thematic areas. Doesn't need to be everywhere where this is offered. And this also allows companies to really tailor that to their strengths or the areas where they've invested quite a lot in sustainability practices. At the moment, the proposal that we have is that entities would need to meet sort of 70% of the relevant leading practices in any given thematic area in order to meet that bar and be able to make a claim that they've achieved leading practice level in those specific areas. So not every leading practice would need to be met in that area, even if it's applicable. And we did ask for some early input from our last public webinar back in July on these proposals. So the first question we asked was, how do you feel about the idea of including new leading practice differentiation in claims? And we had most of the group either cautiously interested or very excited for those who responded to that question. And then we asked about how interested would your organization be in the following types of claims related to that differentiation. So the first being the ability to differentiate by thematic area, and the second would be whether or not we might roll those up to say there's a sort of overarching leading practice across those thematic areas. And we had some good interest in those first two as well. All right, so that's an overview of the structural changes. And now I'm going to turn it over to Chris, who's going to give you a spotlight on some of the proposed content changes under the climate area. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Chelsea. The climate discussion has always been a big but not the only part of the performance standard, and that's something to bear in mind as we go through today. The existing version 3 climate related criteria are really focused in two areas. One on disclosure of greenhouse gas and energy emissions data, the other on emissions reduction targets and performance. And the proposed changes really on the disclosure piece are quite minimal. You won't see significant changes there. There'll still be a requirement in this pre-consultation draft to disclose verified information on emissions. There's some clarity built in, as Chelsea said earlier on, this kind of clarity and requirement that's going to come through. You'll see that in the disclosure piece. But the main area of difference from version 3, this is novel, and we'll be asking for feedback on this, is this alignment between corporate disclosure, corporate inventories that we currently ask for, and product-related emissions inventories. And the reason for this is that as entities continue to and increase an offering of low carbon products, you see them out there in the market today, right? As they offer more and more of those, there's a need to ensure that emissions are allocated truly fairly between those different product groups so that you don't lose emissions from the system. So that's the only change you're going to see in the disclosure piece, but we really, really want your feedback on that. So as we go into public consultation, really do interrogate that as whether it's implementable in practice. Big changes to climate is really a broadening of the focus from just emissions reduction to a net zero alignment focus. What does that mean? It means that it's not just about emissions reduction. We're broadening the scope to look at the impact of emissions removals, avoided emissions, and also climate financing, recognizing the fact that emissions reduction is a lagging indicator. But what we also need to do is to build in some leading indicators of what resources are being put in today in order to deliver climate reduction in the future. Some of those novel technologies like inert anodes, carbon capture, utilization and storage, etc. So you can see this broadening out, not just a focus on emissions reduction targets and performance, but also expanded criteria focused on avoidance removals and climate financing. So an expansion of scope. We have an adaptation criterion. Early days, it's quite, some of the feedback we've got pre-consultation is that is quite immature, but it is an area that needs to be focused on. So we'll have a new criterion on adaptation and resilience. One of the things that we've found as we have implemented version 3, those of you who've kept up with the discussions around target setting and performance, is that 1.5 degree aligned slopes are very challenging for many, but also for our downstream entities. They have other mechanisms to demonstrate 1.5 degree alignment, including science-based targets initiative, absolute contraction approaches, in addition to ASI's ASI method, sectoral decarbonisation approach. So one of the things you'll see in the draft is a flexibility for downstream entities to either use the ASI method, a intensity-based method, or other verified approaches, such as science-based targets. I want to be very, very clear today that we are keeping, at the moment, and certainly in the drafts that we've seen so far and the discussions so far, the ASI method as a valid way of demonstrating 1.5 degree alignment target setting. So we're not getting rid of the ASI method. That's certainly being used by many out there, and they want that to continue. But we're introducing flexibility, particularly for the downstream, to use other ways of demonstrating 1.5 degree alignment. As I mentioned in version 3, we see that 1.5 alignment is challenging. Target setting difficult, performing against those targets extremely challenging. And this is maybe the key change that I would like people to focus on and to give us their feedback on, is that at the moment, a minimum requirement is that 1.5 degree alignment is followed by our entities. That will change in the version 4 draft, and we'll see 1.5 degree alignment become leading practice, with a minimum requirement for some degree of emissions reduction. We don't have much time today to talk about what that degree might look like. I'm happy to talk about that offline, and you will see it in the draft. But that's a key thing, key message that I want people to take away today, is that what we've seen in the exemption process and the challenging alignment with 1.5 degree slopes is that version 4, where we will not want to have an exemption process, we will want to be able to track entities' emissions performance, is that 1.5 alignment will become a leading practice. One final piece is on the smelter emissions thresholds. We currently have emissions thresholds for smelters, which require smelters to reach a certain emissions intensity by a given year, 13 tonnes per tonne 2025, 11 tonnes per tonne in 2030. And what the effect of those thresholds is to exclude a large proportion of primary metal production and associated emissions from certification, and indeed excluded from all the other criteria. It's a cut-off criterion that essentially excludes. We have lots of different opinions on this, lots of different positions, and in consultation, following the pre-consultation work that's gone on, we have a couple of options. And we welcome feedback on alternatives as well. One is to retain a minimum threshold that may sit at 11 tonnes per tonne. I see in the question and answer that someone identifies LME's 10 tonnes per tonne, and we can talk about what impact that might have, 10 or 11 or 15. But essentially, the option 1 is that we do keep a minimum requirement. in order to potentially protect ASI's credibility, also potentially to exclude fossil fuel or new fossil fuel smelters from the system. Option 2 would say get rid of that minimum requirement because we have pathways, forward-looking work. Why do we need a lagging indicator that essentially excludes a large proportion of the industry from certification? So they're essentially the two options. But an interesting new option or interesting new requirement, which has been called for, is for a leading practice with a lower threshold. We would not call it, I'm not going to call it a kind of a low carbon indicator or a green aluminium indicator, but some way of differentiating lower carbon smelting from the rest. And that's present in both of these options today, is that perhaps we could have a leading practice threshold. I've had 6 tons per ton in brackets there. That seems to be what's come through in the pre-consultation. We have had feedback that perhaps that should be 4, 5 others. So the question going out to public consultation, what we want your feedback on is, what does that look like for you? How do you feel about both of those options, but also where that line is set? So big changes in climate. Big message is net zero alignment in additions to emissions reduction. 1.5 degree alignment moves from minimum to leading practice, and smelter thresholds are up for discussion with a number of different options in place. I think that's it for climate.
Thanks, Chris. That was a great summary of what's a range of complicated issues, and a big thank you as well to the climate working group, who's been really helpful at shaping some of these proposals over the last 7 or 8 months. This little red flag there is just an indicator of which of the issues we expect are likely to be kind of most controversial or to gather the most feedback during consultation based on that early pre-consultation input that we've had today. So because we've had a lot of eyes on the drafts and a lot of perspectives in, we already have a pretty good sense of where most of that controversy may sit coming into consultation. And as Chris has just explained very well there, in areas where we know it's going to be complicated and there's probably no right answer, you may see us come out to the first of those consultation periods with a couple of different options to invite feedback on. So moving on to nature and circularity, again, this is just really a high-level spotlight on some of the issues or themes that have been debated and which are now emerging in those drafts. On the nature side, perhaps less significant changes than we'll see in other areas, but we have expanded requirements, particularly around biodiversity impact assessments and management, and that's really with a predominant focus on where those impacts are most material, which is upstream, or also for entities that are operating, for example, in areas like critical habitats. We have had quite a lot of discussion on what expectations then we should have around biodiversity for sites or entities that may not have material risks or impacts on biodiversity. Is that one of the things where actually the approach should be softened to allow those companies to put their efforts and investment elsewhere where the impacts are more material? Or should we maintain a kind of minimum level of expectation around biodiversity improvements on sites or local communities? And the working group doesn't have a very clear answer there, but that will be an area to invite further input on. We are proposing to introduce a set of restrictions for bauxite mining operations in critical habitats, and that aligns with the IFC Performance Standard 6 expectations. That's not a prohibition on mining in critical habitats, but similar to protected areas, has a range of expectations on how that should be done in a sensitive way to really avoid or mitigate impacts where possible. And we're also looking at a proposed adjustment of the definition of protected areas that's in version 3 to better align with the World Database on Protected Areas and the IUCN definition there. So really a sharpening for greater consistency in how that definition is applied, but no changes really on the protected areas approach compared to version 3. And also introduced now into nature and sort of aligned very much with the mine closure section that's being developed as a module is a set of expectations around the progressive rehabilitation for mines in particular, and what that looks like and how that should be aligned with targets around no net loss or net gain that are being set as part of that overall biodiversity management plan. On circularity, this is an area that, as I mentioned earlier, has been elevated from a subsection, underneath our governance, really to stand on its own as a critical impact and thematic area. So really, essential for the aluminium sector in particular, that we work on circularity. And that is one where really, every element of that value chain has a different role to play in making sure that circularity principles are embedded in product design and that flows all the way up the chain to upstream entities. So one of the changes you'll see here is more integration of circularity principles and strategy into the organizational strategy, including resource use assessment, risks, and opportunities. So really trying to move beyond just recycling and thinking about that kind of circularity principles from the start. We have strengthened alignment with international circular economy frameworks, for example, ISO 59004, as mentioned earlier. And we are looking to introduce new requirements on transparency around life cycle assessments, recycled content and product design, and on public disclosure of circularity performance. Importantly, the latest draft has a stronger focus on the recovery and the utilization of post-consumer scrap, as well as SPL, dross, bauxite residue, and other recoverable resources. And that includes some targets and improvement trends, and those currently are being positioned as leading practice as opposed to the minimum requirements. And one of the controversial or complicated issues, which has had a lot of working group time, is also on really where do we go with the LCA requirements in the current version 3? Are they fit for purpose? What is the value that they're delivering? And what degree of verification should we require against those LCAs? So one of the potential things to be explored in consultation is whether there's a potential shift towards asking for cradle-to-grave assessments for downstream entities, for example. And you will see some changes to those LCA requirements, even since earlier versions several months ago, and certainly compared to version 3. All right, moving on to community rights and mine closure. So out of all the areas of the performance standard, these two are really probably least mature in terms of the current drafts. And what I mean by that is that, there's still a lot of open debate and discussion with the working groups to feed in on some of the key issues. So here we're not yet close to having, well, we're getting closer, but we're not yet at the point of having a draft that's ready for approval for consultation. We are still allowing time for those issues to be debated and to surface. On the community rights and participation, we have brought in a strong materiality focus. So some sections of that standard will apply only to upstream entities where impacts on communities may be most significant or material. And impacts for those who are midstream or downstream are likely to be much smaller in terms of changes in this section. So we have brought in additional detail on how affected communities should be identified and carrying out effective consultation with those communities. And that's aiming to really move beyond companies just having to have a management plan for how impacts on local communities are managed, and making sure that that plan is actually implemented effectively in practice. And then where issues do come up, as they always will in this sector, that actually communities feel that they've been heard and listened to, and that effective action has been taken to address their concerns. We have added some new criteria on community benefits and livelihoods. Some of that is sitting certainly in the leading practice section. Very controversially, we've been debating a proposed inclusion of a more specific definition that regards Indigenous people who would otherwise be characterized and meeting the attributes of Indigenous people, but who may not self-identify as Indigenous. And that terminology at the moment that we're using is land-connected communities, but with a narrowly scoped definition. And certainly this is a complex and nuanced area, and there's very strong opinions on both sides in terms of support for and opposition to this proposal. And we're currently in the process of exploring different options and working through different solutions with input from the working group and others. So more to come on that. But if that piques your interest, certainly you're welcome to get in touch and we can share more about where we're at with those proposals. We have, with great input from the working group, brought in a proposed definition around significant impacts as a trigger for requiring free, prior, and informed consent. So really trying to clarify more the types of cases and impacts that would then trigger an FPIC process to be carried out. And that definition aligns with a number of key standards and other frameworks that working group members have recommended. We've also expanded a bit the requirements around security practices in that draft. And then we have moved out for now the resettlement and displacement criteria to a modular section. And we are going to be looking at strengthening the alignment with the IFC Performance Standard 5 for those critical requirements. Also anticipating that that IFC standard is likely to be updated in coming years, and having a modular approach might allow us to maintain alignment a bit better going forward. On mine closure, so this is a section that has also been given its own set of more complex, comprehensive requirements compared to current version 3. And this is really one of the priorities coming out of our Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum as well, as we start to see a number of bauxite mines coming towards closure in future years. So really trying to understand how that closure process is being planned proactively, how post-mining land uses are being agreed, and how those closure objectives are being identified in order to balance what sometimes are quite important but competing interests between biodiversity objectives, local community input and desired outcomes, and also sometimes regulatory expectations, which might be at odds with those other outcomes. We have expanded requirements around the impact assessments and consultation to really make sure that that process is as inclusive as possible. We are looking to maintain and enhance the version 3 requirements, which already do require free, prior, and informed consent around mine closure planning, where Indigenous peoples are affected. We have some new requirements around socioeconomic transitions, and incorporation of circularity principles into closure planning. Some of that, again, is sitting at leading practice level. And there's a clearer expectation for the entity to retain liability in that post-closure phase as well. All right, and last but not least, on workers' rights and participation, just a couple of points to mention. A lot of this has maintained consistency with version 3, still very much aligned with the ILO fundamental principles and rights at work. But we are proposing to introduce a new expectation on payment of living wages. And that is right now framed just for direct employees, with a leading practice expectation to be also looking at gaps and road plans to achieve that for contract employees. And we are looking at a couple of options probably to strengthen some of the limits on working hours, with a couple of options that will go out for consultation. And on those two issues, there is certainly quite a range of different viewpoints coming in through the early consultation, but both of those were strongly supported by our working group and standards committee process. We've also enhanced the approach to occupational health and safety, with inclusion of psychosocial risks and also greater emphasis on the health elements, along with the safety elements as well. So with that, mindful of time, I'm going to turn it over to Chris, who will go through some of the chain of custody summary of process so far. And again, this is just to sort of spotlight, hopefully to give you a sense of some of those issues that are being debated that are most impactful. Chris, over to you.
Thanks very much, Chelsea. So interestingly, we went into chain of custody and asked the question, what is chain of custody for? What's the chain of custody standard for in ASI? And, the purpose of the chain of custody is to drive uptake of the performance standard through the value chain, where risks are mitigated and where performance is improved among the ASI membership. So the chain of custody enhances that by pulling ASI or chain of custody material through the system. And when we revisited the chain of custody this time around, it was interesting because what we were hearing was actually that's a purpose for the organization and for the members, but actually we might like to make some different claims. we might like some different information that chain of custody standard under ASI could help us to access or to answer or to make in the marketplace. And so while we started looking at the chain of custody standard per se, actually what we're interested in as a working group are the kind of claims that our members might want to make, and also the kind of information they might like about their supply chains, in addition to implementation of the chain of custody standard. And I've identified 4 work streams really that have been followed by the working group and that we will be exploring both during the revision process, but also more broadly as an organization. The first of those work streams is around the chain of custody standard per se. I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. And really that's about the claim of ASI material or chain of custody material present in a given shipment. But there are other claims, performance-related claims, so claims related to, let's say, individual criteria in the performance standard, for instance, that the entity has an ASI, greenhouse gas pathways method aligned target. These are independent of chain of custody, but they're a kind of claim that folks might want to make. That's being explored with our membership team as well to understand what kind of claims entities want to make. Another area, important one, is that increasingly we see downstream wanting to understand the mapping of their individual supply chains in order to meet regulatory requirements, in order to reduce risk. That's something that can't be done with our existing chain of custody standard as it stands. It doesn't give you information on identity of where the material has come from, the mine site, etc. It's a mass balance system. So we're exploring other ways of providing that information, potentially through supply chain mapping, risk mapping, etc. It's not part of the consultation paper. You won't see it in there because it sits outside of the revision process, but it is ongoing and it is something that we're exploring both as a standards team, but also more broadly within the organization. The final one, the one we get questions on quite a lot, is on product related claims, product carbon footprint, recycled content, with a kind of an early thought that perhaps our chain of custody standard and the flow of ASI material through the system could allow us to build frameworks for product carbon footprinting. The discussions so far have pointed to the fact that that's extremely challenging, particularly with a mass balance based system. So that is again an area of exploration. It does not form part of the standard as you see it today, although it does have relevance to the prior requirement that I talked about balancing allocated product emissions with corporate emissions. So there is some crossover there. The area this group is focused on, where you'll see it in the pre-consultation, is that area 1. The chain of custody standard itself and what needs to evolve there in order to meet members' needs, to both make claims about ASI material, but also to understand and have confidence in their supply chain. So the next slide, please, Chelsea. One of the things that we have heard quite a loud voice from the working group and from others is that the chain of custody standard, and those who've implemented it today will have will know this, is that there is quite a lot of duplication between the performance standard and the chain of custody standard, particularly around responsible sourcing, due diligence type requirements. And we have been asked, and in the draft you see, we've been asked to remove a lot of the redundancy that sits in the chain of custody standard version 2, to avoid that duplication and potential conflict with the performance standard, and really just to focus on the material accounting elements in the chain of custody standard. Chain of custody standard is not there to measure performance. It's there to give assurance that the material accounting system that the entity has in place to account for chain of custody ASI material inputs and outputs is appropriate. So 1, streamline the chain of custody standard, remove that duplication. You will see significantly shortened, significantly fewer requirements. The second point that's come out of these discussions is that at present in the aluminium sector at scale, non-mixing chain of custody models are not currently possible to be implemented. Number of factors for that, one of which is continuous processing in the primary space, smelting, electrolysis in particular. And so segregation, identity preservation as chain of custody models are off the table for inclusion in an ASI chain of custody standard at present. What does that leave us? That leaves us with the mass balance approach that we currently have today, although potentially with some changes. We know that some members seek to retain the ability to make product-related claims. That's the ASI logo or other product-related or even product-printed claims. It's a relatively small number of members, but very committed members who want to continue to be able to make those claims. There's another, I think, larger cohort that sees an intrinsic value to ASI's credibility through a chain of custody standard offering. They don't necessarily want to make product-related claims, consumer-facing claims, even business-to-business claims, but they do see credibility with ASI sitting with the chain of custody standard that has visibility on these flows of material. That's tied to the third point here, or the fourth point here, numbering's a bit off, sorry, which is that product-related claims probably less important for many than confidence in their supply chain. They want visibility, transparency in their supply chains more than the ability to make a claim to customers or others. And that leads us to a point that, as I mentioned before, mass balance is going to continue to be the approach, but some members see value in enhancing that mass balance model. Maybe there's something we can do to build that confidence in the management of supply chain risks. And that's where the working group has focused over the last few months. And as we go into public consultation with a draft, what I encourage you, our diverse membership that sits all the way along the value chain, as well as in civil society independent of production processes, to give us your feedback on this balance between the burden of implementation of an evolved chain of custody offering and the value that either the material offers your customers or you, or certification itself. So it's not enough that we go out there with an enhanced offering that meets the needs of some in the supply chain. We need to find essentially a trade-off that balances the burden of implementation with the value to the market. Next slide, please. That brings us on to what you will see in public consultation. We will actually articulate some of what this enhanced mass balance could look like, some options for that. One of which is to essentially leave the approach as it is today, to keep an entity level mass balance approach. Some other options out there include minimum sourcing requirements. So not just to have a entity level mass balance that has no requirement for necessarily sourcing ASI material, but rather to say if you're engaging in ASI's chain of custody that you would have some requirements to have in a given material accounting period some minimum sourcing. Third option, which is of interest to some but does come with burden, is the transition from an entity level mass balance to potentially a site level mass balance. Now that has a range of different possibilities, one of which is to keep entity level certification scopes. So that really means that the assurance process remains the same as today. Certification scopes, entities are modeled as today, but that there is site level material accounting. You need to understand that flow of material at the site level, and that is how the material flows through the system. Or an alternative would be that you have site level certification scopes. Lots of a range of possibilities in here. I think under that option C, and you'll see it articulated in the paper, that's not something we could introduce straight away. So that's an option that would require some kind of transition.
It's just a
Chelsea,
quick
please.
time check. Yeah.
Oh, yes. Yep.
maybe a minute, and then we'll shift
Absolutely.
over.
So my main message here is what we need from you is an understanding of, does that meet your needs? What's the value of ASI certification on the one hand and ASI material on the other hand as it flows through these different option systems? And when we talk about value, and I have to be extremely clear here, under the antitrust rules that we operate, is that we are not discussing financial value or premiums. This is about the trade-off or the balance between implementation burden and the value of the information that brings to you and your customers. So it's an area of deep discussion. We've had working groups that I think have been the best attended out of all of the working groups. Lots of different positions that reflect points on the value chain. And we really do encourage you through the public consultation process to actively engage with the chain of custody standard as both an important way of transmitting information along the value chain, but also potentially as a barrier to that. So if there is no value, if there's limited value, we want to hear that too. I guess with that, I'll
Thanks, Chris.
hand back to you, Chelsea.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, sorry, we just have limited minutes, and I'm keen to give Cam a minute or two. So Cam, over to you just to talk a quick bit about the assurance framework before we open to Q&A.
Thanks, Chelsea. As Chelsea has just mentioned, I only need a couple of minutes to let you know that there is a concurrent process with respect to updating the assurance manual or the assurance framework. And this is happening at the moment with the assurance function of the Secretariat, working pretty busy to making the manual a lot more user-friendly moving forward. So the inputs we receive from there is feedback from auditors, feedback from entities, feedback from the Standards Committee, but more importantly, we also have reviewed to date this calendar year over 260 audits through oversight. So we get a lot of feedback, a lot of inputs on where audits may need room for improvement, improved direction, improved flexibility, and actually how to apply the assurance manual in a bit of an easier way too. So the first 3 points, essentially the objectives we're taking through this revision process for the assurance manual is improving the ease of use, flexibility around resourcing, conscious that entities do suffer audit fatigue at times, and with that, looking at the risk piece. So the operational risk, that internal risk, but also the external risk, that reputational risk that ASI and or the entity and the certification framework that we're all part of, ensuring that those particular risks out there are addressed in the audit process. So we're looking at reducing not so much the content, but the scale and size of the manual. I think it's running at 160 pages at the moment. Now, there's not a right or wrong page number, but if we could get that under 100 to make it a bit more of a punchy, more of a visual document, we would like to use case studies, scenarios, a lot of visuals too, to just help out auditors when they're preparing audit teams, and also entities when they're planning for audits too. Public disclosure of upcoming audit dates for initial audits. I've got here on the slide, we propose to do that. We actually will do that, but we will start with those upstream, and by upstream I mean bauxite mining, alumina refining and smelting for the performance standard initially. Those initial audits, we will start publicly disclosing those dates. A couple other things we would like to mandate is a 2-auditor minimum for some of those high-risk entities as well. That also helps in the event of illness or injury or logistical constraints that may occur during an audit, having more flexibility there. Following on from that as well too is promoting through the assurance manual, but also ASI in general, the use of technical specialists. They may not necessarily be ASI accredited as such, but those technical specialists that can help audit teams where there might be a slight resource or knowledge gap. A little bit more nuanced direction on resourcing and scheduling, maybe the option for hybrid or desktop audits too, particularly when there's minimal to no findings in the previous audit, reducing costs, reducing that audit fatigue I just mentioned as well. And then again, looking at the risk profile. If there's a lot of non-conformances and you're in a high-risk setting, well, no, the hybrid or desktop audit probably is not going to work. you'll need to go on site if you're an auditor. But if the risk is low enough, we'll look at more flexibility there. It's happening already, which is great, but closer engagement between the ASI Secretariat and the audit firms and the audit teams with respect to planning, scheduling, looking at the key stakeholders they need to interview during the audit, particularly for those upstream, those audits, the upstream audits where the risk inherently is a lot higher as well. And then a bit more direction about what the headline statements in a public audit report need to include, a bit more clarity, making those fit for purpose and more reader friendly, and following on from that as well too, looking as to how the engagement piece of the audit might be expressed publicly as well. Who spoke to what? Confidentiality notwithstanding, of course. So with a minute to go, I just wanted to give you an idea of timeline. The assurance part of the Secretariat are working with concepts and ideas and structure right now. We're hoping to get something embryonic early in the new year. Following on from that, there'll be a redrafting, a restructuring process in time for potentially that second public consultation period in Q2, Q3 of 2026, where we can get some more input into that. And just finally, like from in 2022, there'll be no transition period. So as soon as the new assurance manual is ready to go and has been signed off by the Standards Committee and the Secretariat, it will go live. There will be no transition period. And that worked well in 2022. It'll work well again without that transition in 2027. So that's it from me, Chelsea, and over to you to wrap things up and a little bit of Q&A, hopefully.
Thanks, Cam. Just to clarify, there will be transition period for the standards being revised, but perhaps not for the assurance accompanying change, just to make sure we're clear. Cam, actually, the open question we've got at the moment is actually related to the assurance points, which is who will decide whether entities are high risk or not, with the reference to requiring 2 auditors. While you answer that, I'll just ask if any further questions come in. Please feel free to drop them in the Q&A. We have a few minutes to answer a couple.
Yeah, good question. And it's something we've trialed putting together at the moment in-house, which is, and it's a pretty significant exercise, but we do have a risk assessment methodology for entities based on setting, size, supply chain activities, those inherent community, environmental, geophysical risks that might be out there, proximity to conflict affected areas, reputational, media risks, and so forth. So we've done a number of analyses in-house just to see how that works. And that will be something that we would like to apply moving forward from 2027.
Thanks, Cam. Yeah, we have a question about regarding information on the Elemental platform. Do we have any hints about how this change will be faced? I think that one also is coming for you, Cam.
I'm just reading it again. Information on the Elemental platform, how the change will be faced. In terms of timing, where our project dev team has been very, very busy working on this tirelessly over the last year or two. We aren't far away from a release. There'll be some beta testing and some piloting. That's actually, some of it's been happening already. There's been a couple of ASI members have actually been doing some testing and trialing themselves too. So we'll be taking their feedback over the next month or two and incorporating that into the new Elemental platform. In terms of a go live date, I can't give you that. There'll be significant, an order of magnitude, greater flexibility with respect to what we'll be able to do with that over time, but that will be a progressive rollout of that functionality. It won't all just happen all of a sudden. Don't know if I've answered the question there correctly, but the change, look, we'll certainly be supporting all users, entities, members, auditors as well in terms of that. There'll be training that'll go with it. There'll be podcasts, little videos, there'll be guides developed and so forth. So you won't be on your own in transitioning to the new platform.
Thank you, Cam. So we'll just give a minute to see if there's a final question or two just to talk about next steps. So as noted, we are still working through some key open issues specifically around the community rights section of the performance standard. So at the moment, we are still expecting to launch first consultation sometime in Q1 of next year. But if that needs to shift back to allow time for those discussions, then it may. And we do welcome comments or thoughts at any time, even if you're not participating in a working group or you're not a technical expert review. If you have concerns, thoughts, suggestions to add on any of the points we've covered today, just drop us an email. You can reach out to Chris or myself directly, or there's a consultation email. We do read those, and we're happy to have a conversation at any point in the process. Revision Hub on our website has information. We have a quarterly digest on progress to date and what's coming up, ability to sign up for future webinars. So please do have a look or sign up for the mailing list. And we have one maybe final question, Chris. I don't know if we've in our final minute, is there a chance to incorporate the new GHG protocols into the standards? We'll see if I turn that one over to you.
Yeah, look, there's lots of change happening elsewhere. We seek alignment. We're looking to incorporate all that into the standard. We currently allow greenhouse gas protocol use in development of your ASI method slope and also in the disclosure piece. So necessarily we will be taking account of all those changes. Science-based targets, net zero standard that's also out for second public consultation at the moment as well. So yes, there is every chance to incorporate greenhouse gas protocol and other developments, I would say, into the guidance for our standard. We will seek to align normative language, absolutely, but I think more importantly, it's in the guidance where you will see that linkage with GHG protocol and other standards and guidelines as well.
Great, thank you, Chris. So we're just a couple minutes over time. Thanks for bearing with us. Really appreciate the engagement and attendance, and hopefully you have a better sense of where we may be headed, and we welcome your ongoing input into the revision process. So thanks very much. Have a good rest of the day or rest of your afternoon or evening, and look forward to speaking soon.